Well, hello, and welcome to our online lecture for what's going to be the last lecture with new material for PBH 205. I'm sad that we're not going to be able to get to do this in person, but I hope that you're all having a lot of fun with family or whatever it is that your Thanksgiving break is bringing to you. Before we dig into our material on population growth and aging, I just wanted to deliver a little bit more information about presentations. Do keep in mind that the rubric for presentations is available on Web Campus in the homework assignments and then research paper folders. You'll see the rubric for your presentation. You should be aiming for about 5 minutes in length, and your plan should be to cover the major sections of your paper. Primarily the introduction, where you tell us why the disease or condition you're talking about is important. The body, where you talk about the prevalence, put some numbers around the problem, talk about the causes or health effects of your problem, and how it links to public health, the topics we've been talking about all semester. Tell us about your prevention plan. Please do make sure that it's not just about education or awareness, but you have some concrete steps that can be taken to help decrease the incidence or prevalence of your condition. And then finally, your conclusion. Just tell us, why is this important? Why are we here listening to your plan? And then do expect to respond to some questions. So that's what you should expect when it comes to presentation day. Again, please email me your presentation by 8 a.m. on the day that you'll be presenting so that I can have those loaded and we can save time in between. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, so in terms of our content today, we're going to be covering two major topics. First of all, population growth, which is an important component of public health, and then we'll talk a bit about aging, which are a little bit more related. Those topics are a bit more related than they may seem to be at first glance. And then you'll have an in-class activity worksheet to finish on your own that will be due before our next class. Okay, so thinking way back to the beginning of the semester, one of our earliest lectures, we talked about population biology. We talked about growth curves. And this isn't something that's unique to people, this principle of carrying capacity that we'll be discussing. It's something that occurs with all kinds of living beings. Basically, any organism that's reproducing, as a rule, will produce more offspring than the population needs to remain stable. And that's because things happen and some of those offspring don't make it, whether we're talking about cells growing in a petri dish, other kinds of mammals, or human beings. All of this rule remains true. We have this idea of carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of organisms that can be supported in a certain environment without degrading that environment. So again, this could be the resources available in the growth medium in a petri dish, or it could be our planet. Regardless of the environment, any environment will have a carrying capacity for a specific population. When we think about how this graphs out, we see this S-curve and J-curve, population growth over time, that again we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester. An S-curve, the population starts out low, begins to increase rapidly, and then when it reaches the carrying capacity of its environment, it evens out. Our other possibility is a J-curve, and this involves a dramatic crash in the numbers of organisms in the population. When the organisms that we're discussing are human beings, obviously we'd rather see an S-curve growth pattern than a J-curve, because that population crash means that large numbers of organisms or people are dying due to the circumstances in their environment. So obviously we'd rather see that S-curve when we're talking about people. What do we know about human population growth so far? We just know that it has increased steadily. We saw that steady beginning of the S-curve or J-curve for the last million years, and then about 200 years ago we saw that rapid population surge that we've talked about a couple of times here in class. When we look at how that projects out, the UN predicts that population is going to be 9.3 billion by 2050. So if we're looking at about 7.5 billion now, that's a little under 2 billion new people before 2050. If you've never seen this before, I'm going to take a quick look at the World Population Growth Meter. And here we have the current world population today at this hour, 7.4 billion and growing. Now this is not that, this doesn't imply that somebody somewhere is sitting there tallying birth certificates and increasing person by person by person. This is all based on statistics about population growth, but still you can see how rapidly it increases minute by minute, hour by hour. And that's how the UN predicts that we're going to be at that 9.3 billion figure by the time we get to 2050. So if we think about how the population is growing and which numbers are increasing, we don't see similar population growth in all different kinds of populations. Here, what you're looking at on your screen right now, the red bar, this is population growth in developed countries from 1750 to the predicted rate in 2050. Excuse me, so what we think of as say, first world countries. And what we typically see in those kinds of countries is that people tend to reproduce at a replacement rate. So, for every one person, there's approximately one baby, and that's what that red bar represents. Now, in developing countries, we obviously see a really different growth pattern that really starts in about 1950 and really takes off. So as we move from 2000 over here to 2050 up at the right, we can see that the bulk of that really dramatic increase in population coming from developing countries. So this is related to a couple of important public health issues, but when we do think about the needs of the people in those countries, they tend to be more extensive than those of us who are already in developed countries and are able to take for granted things like clean air, clean water, good nutrition, that sort of thing. So some really important public health concerns that are related to population growth in those particular areas. When we look at the relationship between public health and population growth, to a certain extent, public health has really contributed to the problem. Basically, our goal here is to help people live longer. So if we're able to keep people alive by increasing access to clean water, increasing the availability of good nutrition, those sorts of things that lead to longer lives, then by keeping more people alive in those countries, maybe better prenatal care, better survivability after childbirth for women and children, then we're contributing to the problem by keeping more people alive. Now, of course, this is a good thing, right? We want to see those goals accomplished in societies around the globe. But in the meantime, as communities are getting used to the idea that people are more likely to survive childhood, live to a healthier old age, we see this population pattern we call the demographic transition. Basically, the verbal description of this is that it takes a while to start to understand on a community-wide basis that children are likely to survive to adulthood. And people don't change their reproduction patterns until they really believe that. So if we look at how that graphs out, we'll take a look at these patterns here. Okay, so this is basically a graphic description of what happens with birth rates and death rates over time as communities get better access to health and healthcare and health supporting behaviors. So if we look at total population in a country with a high birth rate but a fluctuating death rate, so we see people dying in childhood, we see people dying in early adulthood, older adulthood, if they make it, lots of different things that are killing people in different ways that they are dying at times in their lives. So we see the total population stays low because both the birth rate and the death rate are high. Now, moving into stage 2, this is when we start to see some availability of, say, good prenatal care or care for moms during childbirth or access to vaccinations, that sort of thing. We start to see the death rate decline. So that green line, the number of people who are dying on an annual basis, starts to go down. But it takes a while for that birth rate to catch up. So the birth rate stays high up here, and the death rate starts to decrease. So obviously, if the same number of people are being born, but fewer of them are dying, then we start to see the total population tick up. Now, in the third stage, the society is starting to realize that they don't need to reproduce at the same rate in order to keep their society functioning. So we start to see those birth rates begin to drop off. Not as steadily as the death rates do, but we do see that gradual decline. Death rates continue to decline as health improves, and then we end up at this position where all those extra children who were born here continue to grow, and we see that population top out. And then we also see the birth rate and the death rate start to even out down here as well. So stage 1, lots of large families, lots of early deaths. Stage 2, fewer early deaths, but still lots of large families. Stage 3, even fewer early deaths, but the family size starts to decrease. And then in stage 4, it all sort of evens out. And we're at that developed country perspective where we mostly reproduce at a replacement rate, or sometimes even lower than that. Some European societies are dealing with that right now. So that's that idea of the demographic transition, and it's associated with access to better health and health supporting behavior in communities. Okay, I'm going to wrap up our population growth and healthy aging lecture here for a few minutes so you can take a break and have some more turkey or help your mom with pie, whatever's up next for you. And I'll be back with the second part where we'll talk about population growth and some of the public health implications.